The message arrived on Earth during the middle of a Tuesday morning. It traveled faster than light, crossing millions of stars to reach humanity's homeworld. The Galactic Council was calling for an emergency peace summit, and for the first time in human history, Earth was invited. Tay stood in the briefing room, watching the holographic message replay for the third time. He was Earth's newly appointed ambassador to the Galactic Council, though he had never actually met an alien before. The message was formal and cold, explaining that after 300 years of war between the Vrelian Empire and the Thaxian Confederacy, the galaxy was on the edge of total destruction. Every civilization that had faster-than-light travel was required to attend. Required, Tay said quietly, crossing his arms. Not invited, required. Hana, his security chief, stood beside him with her arms also crossed. She was a small woman with sharp eyes that never stopped moving. They don't think much of us, she said. Look at the tone. They're basically telling us to sit in the corner and be quiet. Hyun, the cultural advisor, adjusted his glasses and nodded. Humanity only achieved FTL travel 18 months ago. To them, we're children. Infants, really. They've had space travel for thousands of years. Tay turned off the hologram. Then let's show them what human children can do. 2 weeks later, the human delegation arrived at Concordia Prime. The space station was massive, bigger than Earth's moon. It hung in neutral space, exactly halfway between Vrelian and Thaxian territory. The station had been built specifically for diplomatic meetings, with architecture designed to make every species feel equally uncomfortable. Their ship docked in a bay that smelled of recycled air and ozone. As Tay stepped onto the station, he was immediately struck by the sheer diversity of alien life. Beings made of crystal walked past creatures that looked like floating jellyfish. Something that resembled a walking tree nodded at them with what might have been a head. Ambassador Tay of Earth, a voice boomed from above. Tay looked up and saw a being that towered over everyone else. It was made entirely of blue crystal, with light pulsing through its body like a heartbeat. I am Council Director Vexthar. You are late. Tay checked his watch. We're actually 3 minutes early. By Galactic Standard Time, you are late. Vexithar's crystalline face showed no emotion. Your species will observe the proceedings from the designated area. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not interfere with established protocol. Do you understand? Hana's hand moved toward her weapon, but Tay touched her arm gently. We understand, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They were led to their quarters, which were barely large enough for the 8-person human delegation. The rooms were cold and sterile, with furniture designed for bodies that were definitely not human. Mina, the youngest member of their team, sat on a chair that was too tall and sighed. This is going to be wonderful, she said sarcastically. The opening ceremony began 3 hours later in the Grand Chamber. The room was circular and enormous, with seating arranged in concentric rings. The humans were placed in the outermost ring as far from the center as possible. Tay sat between Hana and Hyun, watching as thousands of delegates filed in. The ceremony itself was incredibly boring. Speaker after speaker came to the center and recited ancient words in languages that required 3 translation devices to understand. Tay counted at least 47 different rituals that seemed to serve no purpose except tradition. This is how they've done things for millennia, Hyun whispered. Every gesture, every word, every moment is choreographed. Deviation from protocol is considered barbaric. How do they get anything done? Tay whispered back. They don't. That's the problem. Finally, the actual peace talks began. The Vrelian Emperor, a massive reptilian creature covered in golden scales, spoke first. His voice was deep and commanding, translated instantly into hundreds of languages. The Thaxian Confederacy must withdraw from the Outer Rim territories. These systems belong to the Vrelian Empire by ancient right. The Thaxian High Speaker, a being that looked like living water contained in a transparent suit, rose to respond. The Vrelian Empire has no claim to systems that were never theirs. The Thaxian Confederacy will not surrender what we have rightfully settled. And so it went back and forth, the same arguments that had been made for 3 centuries. Tay watched other council members nod along, following a script that everyone seemed to know by heart. No one was actually trying to solve anything. They were just performing a play they had performed 1,000 times before. During a break, Tay gathered his delegation in their cramped quarters. Wu, their data specialist, was already working on his portable computer. I've been analyzing the negotiation patterns, he said. They're literally repeating the same arguments from talks held 50 years ago. Word for word in some cases. That's insane, Mina said. She had spent the entire session trying not to fall asleep. Don't they want peace? Hyun shook his head. They want protocol. They want order. Peace is secondary to maintaining the diplomatic system they've built over thousands of years. Hana leaned against the wall, her expression dark. I've been watching the security. It's all for show. I could shut down half this station with a good virus in 3 minutes. We're not shutting down the station, Tay said, though he filed that information away. But we're not going to sit here and watch them dance around the problem for another 300 years either. What are you thinking? Hyun asked carefully. Tay looked at his team. They were young, all of them under 40. Earth had sent them because older, more experienced diplomats were needed for matters closer to home. The Galactic Council probably saw them as naive and inexperienced. Maybe that was an advantage. I'm thinking, Tay said slowly, that someone needs to break the pattern. That's dangerous, Hyun warned. These protocols exist for a reason. If you violate them, we could be expelled from the council before we're even really members. Or, Hana said with a slight smile, we could actually accomplish something. The next day, Tay sat in the grand chamber and watched the performance continue. The Vrelians made their demands. The Thaxians refused. Council mediators offered procedural suggestions that changed nothing. Every word was translated, recorded, and added to an archive that probably no one would ever read. And then Tay made a decision. He had spent his entire diplomatic career following rules, being polite and respecting tradition. But these weren't human traditions. These weren't even effective traditions. They were obstacles preventing real communication. When the Vrelian Emperor began his afternoon statement, repeating the same territorial claims for what must have been the 100th time, Tay stood up. Excuse me, he said. The entire chamber went silent. The Emperor stopped mid-sentence, his golden scales reflecting the harsh light. Vexthar's crystalline body pulsed red. The human delegate will sit down, Vexthar commanded. Tay remained standing. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. I have a question. Gasps echoed through the translation devices. Several delegates made gestures that their translators rendered as shocked horror. Tay had just done something that had not been done in over 2,000 years of Galactic Council history. He had interrupted the Emperor, and he wasn't finished yet. The silence in the Grand Chamber was absolute. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species stared at Tay. The human ambassador could feel their shock, their outrage, their confusion. He had broken the most sacred rule of galactic diplomacy, and everyone knew it. You dare interrupt the Emperor? Vexthar's voice boomed, his crystalline body now pulsing an angry red. This is an unforgivable violation of protocol. Guards removed the human delegation immediately. But before the guards could move, something unexpected happened. The Thaxian High Speaker, the living water being, raised one of its flowing appendages. Wait, it said, its voice like waves on a shore. Let the human speak. I am curious what question could be so important that it warrants breaking 3,000 years of tradition. Tai felt Hana tense beside him, ready to fight if needed. But he kept his eyes on the center of the chamber. Your Majesty, he said to the Vrelian Emperor, you have spoken for 3 days about territorial rights. You have cited ancient treaties and historical claims, but I have a simple question. What do your people actually want? The Emperor's golden scales rippled. My people want what is rightfully theirs. No, Tay said, taking a step forward. I'm not asking what your government wants. I'm asking what the regular people want. The farmers, the workers, the families. What do they want? A murmur ran through the chamber. Several delegates began talking at once. Vexthar slammed something against his podium, creating a sound like breaking glass. This is highly irregular. The human shows his species' barbarism by even asking such a question. Tay ignored him and turned to the Thaxian High Speaker. And you, High Speaker? What do the Thaxian people want? Not the Confederacy, not the military, the actual people. The High Speaker was silent for a moment. Its watery form rippled and flowed. The people want peace, it said quietly. They have wanted peace for generations. As do mine, the Vrelian Emperor said, and for just a moment, something that looked like sadness crossed his reptilian face. But peace requires honor. Peace requires justice. Peace requires talking like real people instead of reading from ancient scripts, Tay said. He could see Hyun shaking his head in the peripheral vision, but there was no going back now. You have both been at war for 300 years. How many have died? How many families have been destroyed? And for what? For territories that will mean nothing if your civilizations collapse from endless war. Vexthar stood, his massive crystalline form towering over the chamber. The human delegate has violated every protocol of this council. I move for immediate expulsion. I second the motion, said a delegate that looked like a floating brain in a jar. Third, said another, this one resembling a giant insect. But then something else happened. A young Vrelian delegate, much smaller than the Emperor, stood up. I wish to hear more from the human. An equally young Thaxian delegate rose. As do I. This is outrageous, Vexthar shouted. You cannot simply actually, Hyun said, standing up beside Tae. According to Council Rules Section 47, Subsection 12, any delegate may request extended commentary from another delegate if they believe it serves the cause of peace. 2 requests have been made. Vexthar's color shifted from red to purple. You dare quote council rules to me? Someone has to actually read them, Hyun said calmly. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates were shouting in hundreds of languages. Translation devices were working overtime, creating a cacophony of sound. Some species were demanding the humans be expelled immediately. Others were calling for order. A few were actually asking Tae to continue. During the confusion, Wu quickly moved through the chamber, distributing data tablets to any delegate who would take them. Most refused, but some of the younger delegates accepted out of curiosity. What is this? One of them asked. Information, Wu said simply. We conducted surveys among civilian populations of both the Vrelian Empire and the Thaxian Confederacy. We asked them what they wanted. The results are on those tablets. This is illegal, Vexthar thundered. Unauthorized contact with populations during peace negotiations is strictly forbidden. We made the contacts before the negotiations started, Wu said with an innocent smile. We're new to galactic diplomacy. We didn't know we weren't supposed to actually ask people what they thought. Tae watched as delegates began looking at the tablets. He could see their faces change as they read the data. The surveys were simple, conducted through public communication channels. The questions were basic. Do you want the war to continue? What would you sacrifice for peace? Do you trust your government to represent your wishes? The answers were remarkably consistent across both empires. The people were tired. They were scared. They wanted the war to end, and they didn't care much about the territorial disputes that their governments found so important. This is propaganda, the Vrelian Emperor declared, but his voice lacked conviction. It's data, Tae said. Raw, unfiltered data from your own people. Maybe instead of arguing about ancient rights and historical treaties, we should talk about what the people you represent actually need. A delegate from a neutral species stood up. It was a being that looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes. The human makes a valid point, it said. We have been negotiating the same points for centuries. Perhaps a new approach is warranted. Never, Vexthar said. The protocols exist for a reason. Without structure, without order, we descend into chaos. And with too much structure, Tae said, you descend into paralysis. You become so obsessed with following the rules that you forget why the rules exist in the first place. Hana stepped forward, and Tai saw that she was holding a small device. While we're breaking rules, she said, there's something else you should all know. Your secure translation matrix has been filtering what you say to each other for decades. The council has been softening harsh words, hiding insults, and making you all sound more diplomatic than you actually are. She pressed a button on her device. Suddenly, the translations changed. The polite, formal language that had been the standard for millennia was replaced with raw, honest translations. Delegates who had been speaking with careful courtesy were suddenly revealed to be saying much harsher things. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A Vrelian delegate who had been speaking about unfortunate historical circumstances was now clearly saying that the Thaxians were thieves and liars. A Thaxian speaker who had mentioned disagreements in interpretation was actually calling the Vrelians bloodthirsty warmongers. But something else happened too. Some delegates who had seemed cold and distant were revealed to be speaking with genuine sadness about the war. Others who appeared angry were actually expressing fear for their people's future. You have hacked our systems, Vexthar roared, and this time his anger was completely genuine. not filtered through diplomatic language. We improved them, Hana said. Now you're actually hearing what everyone really means. You're welcome. The grand chamber descended into complete chaos. Delegates were shouting at each other in their real voices without diplomatic filters. Guards were trying to restore order. Vexthar was demanding the humans be arrested. And through it all, Tay stood calmly at the center, watching the carefully constructed facade of galactic diplomacy crumble around him. Mina leaned close to Hyun. Did we just destroy 3,000 years of diplomatic tradition? Hyun nodded slowly. I believe we did. Good, she said. As guards moved toward the human delegation, the young Vrelian and Thaxian delegates who had spoken earlier moved to block them. They were joined by others, mostly younger members of various species who had watched the proceedings with growing frustration. Let them speak, the young Vrelian said. For once, let us hear truth instead of protocol. The young Thaxian agreed. We have followed the old ways for 3 centuries, and what has it brought us? Nothing but more war, more death, more suffering. Perhaps the humans are right. Perhaps we need chaos to break the pattern. Tay looked at his team. They had gone from observers to the center of a diplomatic crisis in less than 3 days. They had broken every rule, violated every protocol, and quite possibly made themselves the most hated delegation in galactic history. But they had also done something no one else had managed in 300 years. They had made people actually talk to each other, honestly and without filters. Whether that would lead to peace or disaster remained to be seen. Well, Tay said quietly to Hana, I don't think we're sitting in the corner anymore. No, she agreed, her hand on her weapon as guards surrounded them. We're definitely not. The guards stopped advancing when something unexpected happened. The young delegates from various species formed a circle around the humans, blocking access. It was a physical act of defiance that left Vexthar sputtering in rage. Stand aside, the council director commanded. These criminals must be removed. On what charges? The young Vrelian delegate asked. His scales were green, not gold like the Emperor's, marking him as lower rank. They asked questions. They shared information. Since when is that a crime? They violated protocol, Vexthar said, his crystalline body pulsing between red and purple. They hacked our systems. They disrupted official proceedings. Tay stepped forward, careful to keep his voice calm. We turned off a filter that was hiding the truth. If honest communication is disruption, then maybe your system needs to be disrupted. The Grand Chamber was still in chaos. Delegates were arguing with each other, some defending the humans, others demanding their immediate expulsion. The careful order that had defined galactic diplomacy for millennia was completely shattered. The Vrelian Emperor raised his massive clawed hand, and gradually the noise died down. Everyone waited to hear what he would say. He looked at Tay for a long moment, his reptilian eyes unreadable. The human speaks harsh truths, the Emperor said finally. But truth, even harsh truth, may be what we need. He turned to Vexthar. I wish to hear what the humans propose. If they are so certain our methods are wrong, let them show us their way. This is madness, Vexthar said. The protocols have maintained peace in the galaxy for thousands of years. Peace. The Thaxian High Speaker's watery form rippled with something that might have been laughter. We have been at war for 3 centuries. That is not peace, Director. That is failure dressed in ceremony. Vexthar looked like he wanted to argue more, but he simply returned to his seat, his color now a sullen dark blue. Very well, he said. Let the humans show us their methods. When they fail, perhaps the Council will remember why we value tradition. Tay felt Hana's hand on his shoulder. A silent warning. They were being given a chance, but it was also a trap. If their methods failed, it would prove that the old ways were correct. The humans would be blamed for any problems that followed, but they had already come this far. There was no turning back now. Thank you, Tay said. He looked around the chamber at thousands of faces, some hostile, some curious, most just tired. The first thing we need to do is stop talking like diplomats and start talking like people. That means no more formal sessions in this chamber. No more ancient rituals, no more reading from prepared scripts. Outrageous, muttered several delegates. Instead, Tay continued, we're going to break into small groups, Vrelians and Thaxians together, along with representatives from neutral species. You're going to meet in informal settings, without mediators, without protocols, without anyone recording your words for the archives. That defeats the entire purpose of official negotiations, Bexthar said. The purpose of negotiations is to reach peace, Tay replied. Everything else is just theater. Over the next hour, despite considerable protest, the humans organized the delegates into small groups. Hyun worked with the council staff to identify meeting spaces throughout Concordia Prime. Wu created random assignments, deliberately mixing senior and junior delegates, hawks and doves, to prevent the formation of predictable alliances. But the real surprise came when Hana announced her plan. We're going to do team-building exercises, she said. The translator devices struggled with the concept. Several delegates asked for clarification, clearly confused. Games, Hana explained. Puzzles, competitions, activities where you have to work together to succeed. This is beneath the dignity of an imperial delegation, one of the senior Vrelian officers said. Then don't participate, Hana replied with a shrug. But your people are going to be working alongside Thaxians to solve problems. They might learn something. They might even enjoy themselves. The officer looked offended, but the young Vrelian delegate stepped forward. I will participate, he said. If humans believe these activities have value, I am willing to try. His name, they learned, was Cal. The young Thaxian delegate, whose name translated roughly as Suri, also volunteered. Within minutes, several other younger delegates joined them, driven by curiosity or boredom or simple frustration with the endless formal proceedings. Hana organized them into the first activity, something she called an escape room. She had convinced the station staff to seal a conference room and create a series of puzzles that required teamwork to solve. Cal and Suri were assigned to the same team, along with delegates from 3 neutral species. At first, they stood awkwardly, not knowing how to interact without diplomatic protocols. But puzzles don't care about protocols. When Cal found the first clue, he had to explain it to Suri. When Suri figured out a code, she had to share it with Cal. Slowly, hesitantly, they began working together. Meanwhile, Quan, one of the human delegates who had been mostly quiet until now, organized a cooking competition. He convinced the station's food services to provide ingredients from various worlds, then challenged teams to create meals together. I don't understand the point of this, a jellyfish-like delegate said, floating uncertainly over a cooking station. The point, Quan said, is that cooking together requires trust. You have to share tasks, you have to communicate, and at the end, you share a meal, which is one of the most basic forms of connection in any culture. What started as confusion gradually became something else. Delegates who had been mortal enemies were now arguing about seasoning and cooking times. A Vrelian captain and a Thaxian commander discovered they both preferred their protein cooked the same way. Small connections, meaningless in themselves, but they were connections nonetheless. Sora, the human medical officer, had been watching the formal proceedings with growing concern. She noticed that many delegates showed signs of extreme stress. Some were clearly exhausted, others appeared to be dealing with trauma. So she did what doctors do. She created a space for healing. She converted one of the station's observation decks into what she called a wellness center. Comfortable seating, soft lighting, and windows showing the stars. No recording devices, no official observers. Just a quiet place where stressed diplomats could relax without maintaining their political masks. The first visitors came out of curiosity, but word spread quickly. Here was a place where a Vrelian could admit to being tired, where a Thaxian could confess to missing their family, where any delegate could simply be a person instead of a political symbol. By the end of the first day of human methods, something remarkable was happening throughout Concordia Prime. Small groups of delegates were scattered across the station working on puzzles, cooking meals, playing games, or simply talking without the weight of official negotiations pressing down on them. In the escape room, Cal and Suri's team had successfully solved the final puzzle. They had high-fived, a human gesture that Hana had taught them, and were now laughing together about their confusion at some of the clues. You know, Cal said carefully, in all my years of military service, I've never actually spoken to a Thaxian before. Not really. It was always through translators, through diplomatic channels during formal meetings. Suri's watery form rippled thoughtfully. The same is true for me. I was taught that Vrelians were monsters, brutal warriors without mercy. And I was taught that Thaxians were deceitful, that your word could not be trusted. They were both quiet for a moment. Then Suri said, "You don't seem like a monster, and you don't seem deceitful." It was a small moment, barely worth noting, but it was real in a way that 3 days of formal negotiations had not been. And it was happening in dozens of places across the station, as enemies began to see each other as individuals rather than symbols. Back in the Grand Chamber, Vexthar sat alone at his podium, watching reports come in from throughout the station. His aides kept bringing him updates about the various human-organized activities. Each report was more disturbing than the last. "They're playing cards now," one aide reported. The humans taught them a game called poker. "Delegates are betting with ship components. There's a sporting competition in Bay 7. Mixed teams. Vrelians and Thaxians on the same side. The wellness center is at capacity. Delegates are sharing personal stories about their families, about their fears. It's completely unregulated." Vexthar's crystalline form had turned a dark, muddy color. "This is chaos," he muttered. "Complete chaos." But his chief aide, an older being who had served on the council for centuries, looked at the reports differently. "Director," she said quietly, "there hasn't been a single fight. No incidents. No violence. Despite mixing hostile forces throughout the station, despite removing all security protocols, despite completely abandoning diplomatic structure, there has been no violence." "That proves nothing," Vexthar said. "It proves something," she replied. "I'm just not sure what yet." In their cramped quarters, the human delegation gathered to assess the first day. They were exhausted but energized. They had expected resistance, and they had gotten it. But they had also seen something they hadn't dared hope for: genuine connection between enemies. "It's working," Mina said, barely containing her excitement. "People are actually talking to each other." The second day of human-led activities began with an assassination attempt. Tay was walking through one of the station's corridors when a pulse blast hit the wall beside his head. Hana moved instantly, tackling him to the ground as 2 more shots burned the air where he had been standing. She had her weapon out and was returning fire before Tay even processed what was happening. The attacker was a Vrelian, but not a soldier. Just a delegate who had finally snapped under the pressure of seeing everything he believed in collapse. Station security captured him within minutes, and remarkably, he wasn't injured. Hana had only fired warning shots. "You're destroying everything," the attacker shouted as guards dragged him away. 3,000 years of order and you're tearing it down." Tay stood up slowly, his heart racing. He noticed that both Vrelian and Thaxian security personnel had responded to the attack, working together without hesitation. "That was new. Are you all right?" Cal appeared from around the corner, genuine concern on his reptilian face. "I'm fine," Tay said. "Thanks to Hana." "This is my fault," Cal said. "Some of our older delegates cannot accept the changes. They see cooperation as weakness." "It's not weakness," Suri said, appearing beside Cal. The two of them had apparently been walking together. "It's strength. But strength looks different than what we were taught." Word of the attack spread quickly through the station. Vexthar called an emergency session of the council, clearly hoping to use the incident to shut down the human activities. But when the delegates gathered, something unexpected happened. Senior delegates from both the Vrelian Empire and the Thaxian Confederacy stood together to condemn the attack. They announced that they would personally participate in the next round of activities to show that violence would not be tolerated. Vexthar looked like his crystalline body might crack from frustration. "This is exactly what I warned about. The humans have created chaos and now violence follows. 1 person out of thousands," the Vrelian Emperor said, and he was stopped immediately by security forces working together. Perhaps that says something about the effectiveness of these new methods. The human activities continued, now with even more participants. The senior Vrelian military officer who had initially refused to participate showed up at Hana's team-building session. He was paired with a Thaxian admiral, and the two of them were assigned to solve a complex puzzle together. At first, they worked in silence, each trying to solve their part without help. But the puzzle was designed so that no one person could solve it alone. Eventually, the Vrelian officer had to ask for help. "I cannot figure out this section," he admitted grudgingly. The Thaxian admiral looked at the puzzle. "I have the same problem with mine. But if we combine what we've learned..." They worked together for the next hour. By the end, they were communicating efficiently, even anticipating each other's thoughts. When they finally solved the puzzle, there was a moment of awkward silence as they realized they had just cooperated with the enemy. "That was not as terrible as I expected," the Vrelian officer said finally. "High praise indeed," the Thaxian admiral replied, and something that might have been humor rippled through her watery form. Quan's cooking competitions had evolved into something more elaborate. He was now organizing what he called a cultural exchange dinner where teams from different species prepared meals from their homeworlds and shared them with everyone. The dining hall was filled with strange smells and stranger dishes. A Vrelian dish that looked like glowing fungus sat next to a Thaxian creation that resembled liquid crystal. Delegates who had been shooting at each other months ago were now teaching each other recipes. "This is bizarre," Mina said, watching a group of delegates argue passionately about the proper way to prepare a dish from a planet she'd never heard of. "This is human," Tay replied. "We bond over food. We always have. Why shouldn't it work for everyone else?" In Sora's wellness center, something even more profound was happening. Delegates were beginning to share their stories, their real stories. Not the official versions they told for political purposes. A Vrelian soldier talked about losing his entire squadron in a battle, how he still saw their faces when he closed his eyes. A Thaxian civilian described watching her colony destroyed from orbit, the helplessness of knowing she could do nothing to save her friends. Others shared similar tales of loss and pain and trauma that had never healed. "The war has taken so much from all of us," one delegate said. "And for what? I can't even remember why it started anymore." "Ancient territorial disputes," another replied. "Rights to systems that nobody lives on. The kind of things that seemed important 300 years ago but mean nothing now." Sora listened to them all, offering comfort where she could but mostly just providing a space where people could be honest about their pain. She noticed that as delegates shared their stories, something changed. They stopped seeing each other as enemies and started seeing each other as fellow survivors of the same terrible war. Meanwhile, Jin had been busy with a project of his own. The quiet analyst had spent the past day digging through the council's archives, and what he found was disturbing. He called an urgent meeting with Tay and showed him the data. "Look at this," Jin said, pulling up charts and documents. "The council's official records show that they've been mediating this war for 300 years. But look at the actual negotiations. Look at the outcomes." Tay studied the information. "They've been deliberately slowing down progress. Not just slowing it down," Jin said, "preventing it entirely. Every time the Vrelians and Thaxians got close to an agreement, the council found procedural reasons to delay. Every time a promising initiative emerged, they buried it in committees. Why would they do that? Because," Hyun said, entering the room with more data, "the council's power comes from being needed. If the war ended, if the galaxy achieved lasting peace, what would the council do? They've built an entire bureaucracy around managing conflict. Peace would make them irrelevant." Wu joined them, his face grim. "It's worse than that. I tracked the economic data. Several council members have financial interests in war production. They've been profiting from this conflict for centuries." Tay felt cold anger building in his chest. "They've been letting people die to maintain their own power?" "And their wealth," Jin confirmed. "The protocols, the procedures, the endless ceremonies. It's all designed to prevent actual resolution. They're not peace brokers. They're war managers." "We need to expose this," Mina said. "If we do, we're declaring war on the entire council establishment," Hyun warned. "They will destroy us." Tay looked at his team. They were all young, all relatively inexperienced, and they had somehow stumbled onto a conspiracy that spanned centuries. The smart thing would be to keep quiet, to focus on their activities and hope they could make a difference without upsetting the power structure. But Tay had never been particularly smart about these things. "We expose it," he said. "That's what we came here to do. Not just to help two empires make peace, but to show that the old ways are broken. If the council itself is corrupt, then everyone needs to know." The next day, during what was supposed to be a routine progress report, Jin stood before the assembled delegates and released his findings. The data scrolled across every screen in the chamber, showing years of deliberate obstruction, financial conflicts of interest, and coordinated efforts to prolong the war. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates from dozens of species began demanding answers. Vexthar tried to shut down the presentation, but the information was already spreading through the station's networks. "Wu had made sure of that. These allegations are baseless," Vexthar shouted. The humans are spreading lies to justify their disruption of proper procedure. The data comes from your own archives, Jin said calmly. Every document is officially recorded. Every transaction is verified. I'm not making accusations. I'm just showing what the records say. The Vrelian Emperor stood, his massive form radiating controlled fury. Council Director Vexthar explained these documents. Explain why the Council blocked peace initiatives that my own advisors recommended. And mine, the Thaxian High Speaker added, her watery form churning with anger. We have lost millions because of this war. If the Council has been prolonging it deliberately, this is taken out of context. Vexthar insisted, but his crystalline body was flickering between colors rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. The Council has always acted in the best interests of galactic stability. Stability, Tay said, standing beside Jin, or stagnation. There's a difference between maintaining peace and preventing change. Other delegates were now reviewing the data, and the more they read, the angrier they became. Even species that had supported the Council's traditional approach were questioning whether they had been manipulated. A senior delegate from a neutral species stood up, her multiple arms gesturing frantically. I have served the Council for 200 years. If these accusations are true, everything I have worked for has been a lie. They're not true, Vexthar said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Then provide evidence, the Emperor demanded. Show us records that contradict this data. Explain these financial transactions. Justify your actions. Vexthar looked around the chamber, seeing his support crumbling. The younger delegates. The station was in chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos than before. This was organized, purposeful chaos. Delegates who had spent centuries following orders were now asking questions. Junior officers were demanding accountability from their superiors. The careful hierarchy that had defined galactic politics was fracturing. Vexthar attempted to restore order by calling for a vote to expel the human delegation and shut down all informal activities. But when the vote came, something unprecedented happened. It failed, not by a small margin, but overwhelmingly. Even delegates from species that traditionally supported the Council's conservative approach voted against the measure. This is impossible, Vexthar said, staring at the vote tally. The protocols should prevent this. The protocols, Hyun said from the gallery, were written assuming everyone would follow them. But rules only work if people believe in them. While the Council leadership struggled to maintain control, something remarkable was happening in the informal sessions. Groups of mid-level delegates from both the Vrelian Empire and the Thaxian Confederacy had continued meeting, and they had done something that 300 years of official negotiations had failed to accomplish. They had drafted a peace treaty. It wasn't an official document. It hadn't been approved by any government or reviewed by any legal team. It was written on portable tablets during breaks between cooking competitions and puzzle-solving sessions. But it existed, and it was remarkably practical. Cal presented it to Tay one evening in the wellness center. We know this isn't official, the young Vrelian said, but we had to try. All of us together, we just started talking about what peace might actually look like. Tay read through the document. It was rough, with spelling errors and unclear phrasing, but the core ideas were solid. Territory divisions based on actual population needs rather than ancient claims, trade agreements that benefited both empires, security arrangements that assumed cooperation rather than conflict. This is good work, Tay said honestly. Really good. It will never be accepted, Suri said, her watery form dimmer than usual. Our government sent us here to observe. We have no authority to negotiate peace. Maybe that's exactly why you could do it, Sora suggested. She had been listening quietly while monitoring the emotional states of the delegates. You're not carrying the weight of political careers or historical grudges. You could just focus on what actually makes sense. Mina had joined them and was reading the treaty draft on her own tablet. You need to present this, she said. Not to the Council, not to your governments. To the people. How? Cal asked. We have no access to communication networks. Yes, you do, Wu said, appearing from behind a partition with a mischievous grin. You have us. Over the next several hours, the humans worked with the young delegates to refine the treaty draft. They kept the language simple and clear, avoiding the complex legal terminology that typically buried the actual meaning of agreements. They added real examples of how provisions would work. They included testimonials from delegates about why they supported it. Then Wu did what he did best. He hacked into the communication networks of both empires simultaneously and broadcast the treaty directly to civilian populations, bypassing all official channels. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across both empires, people who had been suffering through 3 centuries of war saw a genuine path to peace for the first time. They didn't care that it wasn't official. They didn't care that it violated protocols. They just cared that someone was finally offering them hope. Support messages flooded back to Concordia Prime. Civilian groups organized demonstrations demanding their governments accept the terms. Military officers who had lost entire units started speaking publicly about wanting the war to end. Even some government officials began cautiously expressing support. Vexthar tried to suppress the broadcast, but it was too late. The information had spread too far, too fast. For the first time in galactic history, civilian populations were directly influencing diplomatic negotiations. The council director called an emergency session, his crystalline body flickering with barely controlled rage. The humans have committed espionage, violated communication protocols, and undermined governmental authority, he declared. They must be arrested immediately. But before guards could move, the Vrelian Emperor stood. "No," he said simply. "Your Majesty, they have violated. They have given my people hope," the Emperor interrupted. "For 300 years we have followed your protocols, and what has it brought us? Nothing but death and destruction. These humans, these newcomers who know nothing of our traditions, have accomplished more in 1 week than you have in 3 centuries. The Thaxian High Speaker rose as well. "I agree with the Emperor. The treaty drafted by our junior delegates has more support among our populations than anything our governments have proposed. Perhaps we should listen to what our people are telling us." Vexthar looked around the chamber, searching for support, but found none. Even his longtime allies were silent, unwilling to speak against such popular sentiment. "This is chaos," Vexthar said weakly. "This is democracy," Tay replied. "It's messy and unpredictable and sometimes chaotic, but it's also honest. People get to decide their own future instead of having it decided for them by bureaucrats who profit from their suffering." The accusation hung in the air. Jin's data had done its work. Everyone in the chamber knew about the financial interests, the deliberate delays, the corruption that had infected the council's leadership. "I resign," Vexthar said suddenly. The words seemed to surprise even him, but once spoken he couldn't take them back. "Effective immediately, I resign as council director." A shocked silence filled the chamber. In 3,000 years of council history, no director had ever resigned. Vexthar's crystalline form had turned gray like stone. "Perhaps you're right, human. Perhaps we have been managing the war instead of ending it. Perhaps we have let tradition become more important than purpose." He looked directly at Tay. "I hope your chaos serves you better than our order served us." He left the chamber, and with him went the last resistance to the changes sweeping through the council. The next 2 days were a flurry of activity. The informal treaty became the basis for official negotiations, with senior diplomats working alongside the junior delegates who had drafted it. The human team helped facilitate discussions, but now they were working with the system instead of against it. Hana organized security protocols that assumed cooperation rather than conflict. Quan continued his cultural exchange programs, now expanded to include delegates from dozens of species. Sora's Wellness Center became a permanent feature of the station, a place where diplomats could process the emotional weight of their work. And throughout it all, Cal and Suri became unlikely symbols of the new approach, a Vrelian and a Thaxian working together, proving that ancient enemies could become allies. On the 5th day, the Vrelian Emperor and the Thaxian High Speaker stood together before the assembled council. They held between them a document, the Concordia Accords, named not for the station but for the harmony the word represented in human languages. "We sign this treaty," the Emperor said, "not because we agree on everything, not because centuries of distrust have suddenly vanished, but because our people deserve peace, because the alternative is mutual destruction, because sometimes the brave choice is to stop fighting. This treaty is imperfect," the High Speaker added. "It will require work and compromise and continued effort. But it is real. It is honest, and it is ours, created not by ancient protocols but by people who dared to imagine something better." They signed together, and the chamber erupted in applause, not the polite formal acknowledgement that usually followed diplomatic agreements, but genuine celebration. Delegates from dozens of species stood and cheered. Tay watched from the gallery, his team around him. They had come to Concordia Prime expecting to observe history. Instead, they had made it. "We're being promoted," Hyun said, showing Tay a message on his tablet. "Earth's government is appointing us as permanent mediators to the Council." "That sounds like a lot of work," Mina said. "It is," Tay agreed. "But someone has to do it." Hana was watching the security feeds, making sure the celebration remained peaceful. "Think they learned anything?" she asked. "Maybe," Tay said. "Or maybe we'll have to keep teaching them." A week later, Tay found himself in a repurposed conference room that had been converted into what could only be described as a game room. Several young delegates were gathered around a table while Quan taught them poker. The sight of a Vrelian trying to maintain a poker face, while a Thaxian attempted to bluff, was bizarre enough to be funny. "The human approach seems to be working," a voice said behind him. Tay turned to find the Vrelian Emperor. Without his usual entourage of guards and advisors, the massive reptilian looked somehow smaller, more approachable. "It's not really a human approach, Your Majesty," Tay said. "It's just common sense. Talk to each other like people. Find common ground. Remember that the goal is peace, not victory." "Simple concepts," the Emperor said, "but apparently difficult for us to remember. We became so focused on the formality of negotiations that we forgot what we were negotiating for." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the card game.